Well, I didn't grow up in Bundaberg. I lived in Bundaberg for the first 2 years of my life. My father was a guard in the Queensland Railway, so he was transferred all over the state. So I actually spent about 2 years in Bundaberg, 3 years in Mitchell, about 2 years in Brisbane, and then about 7 years in Caboolture, which is just over the line a bit. And then he was transferred back to Brisbane and stayed here permanently then until he retired from the railways. But I guess the most significant part of my childhood was the boyhood around Caboolture from when I was about 6 years old until I was about 12 or 13 years of age. It was a bush school of the 30s. They were very, very hard times, of course. We were lucky. Dad was working, I think, half time. He got half time, so we were relatively affluent people. He would get 3 days work one week and 2 days work the next week. There were a lot of people out of the time. So it was fairly typical of a small bush community. It wasn't all that far from Brisbane, only about 30 miles, 35 miles from Brisbane, but just the same, it was still pretty much a bush community. And an interesting thing about it, too, was that the social and moral outlook in the bush in the 30s was still very close to what it had been for the previous 40-odd years, right from the 1890s. It was still almost a Victorian, Edwardian sort of moral and ethical setup. Schooling was intensely pragmatic in Queensland. It was different rather from the syllabuses they had in the southern states, Victoria and New South Wales. Here in Queensland, when you went to school, they taught you to write as well as possible, to read fluently, and to count your money. And also, when you got through to about year 7, they taught you all sorts of intricate things like how long it would take to fill a 2,000-gallon tank with a pipe delivering water into it at 40 gallons an hour and a pipe taking water out of it at 20 gallons an hour. In other words, or what length of timber you'd need to construct the floor of a building, all that sort of thing, the irregular shaped floors. So we were taught intensely practical things, pragmatic things. Just the idea, of course, that nobody had any idea of the enormous leaps in technology that would take place. And of course, it was taken for granted that the building materials, there was so much timber in Queensland. The reason why all Queensland homes, just about all Queensland homes are made out of timber is because there was just so much timber here, and nobody ever thought it would run out. Nowadays, we're down to sort of kainite, wood chip, plastic, brick, tile, all sorts of material. But in those days, everyone was convinced it was going to be wood for always because the forests were exhausted. And so we had quite a different outlook, quite different background, and quite a different system of beliefs. We had our problems, but all in all, I don't think we had as many problems as young people do nowadays. I think they have far more problems than we do.
They're pleasant years or not?
They're very pleasant years. I never ever had any money, but we were, well, my family anyway, our parents clothed and fed us adequately, or as adequately as they could possibly do it. And of course, we had very little in the way of organised sport. We used to just head bush. We used to go bush at every opportunity. And I spent just about all of my spare time between the ages of 6 and 12. When I wasn't at school, when I wasn't having to do jobs at home, I was in the bush. It wasn't a particularly interesting sort of bush because it was flat Wallam country around there. But we respected people who were useful in the bush. or the skills that made you look up to a man in those days was the ability to have a sense of direction, to be able to go through this featureless warm country and go where you wanted to go and get to where you were intended to go. And at the same time, retain your sense of direction. And I think I developed a fair sense of direction and a fair memory for places at that time. Because I know now that having driven over the state, in most of the roads in Queensland I've covered except the Gulf country, I can still remember where all the turn-offs are. Yeah, over that enormous road system. And I put this all down to the fact that I grew up in the Wallam country where there weren't any landmarks, and you sort of photographed everything automatically with your mind. It was just a skill that was developed at that time.
Did any of your writing skills or poetry interests surface at that time, or was it later?
No, well, there were some poems I didn't mind at school. Of course, we had the old Queensland Red Reader, and we had poems like How Gellert Died, and Sir Walter Scott, and Duncan Campbell Scott, another Scott, and Longfellow, Tennyson, poets like that. But I wasn't particularly interested in them. And in fact, I left school just as quickly as I could. As soon as I turned 14, which was the legal age to leave school, I left school. And I had three ambitions. I wanted to be a rabbit trapper, and I wanted to go to sea, and I wanted to drive a locomotive. Well, I never became a rabbit trapper, but I might get round to that yet. But I did the other two.
What did you do when you left school at 14?
When I left school at 14, on my first job, I had a job at 75 cents a week, carrying boxes of groceries, delivering boxes of groceries around Paddington in Brisbane. That only lasted for about 3 weeks. I ate my way out of that job. I'd never been in contact with so much food in one place before. There wasn't that grocery shop, and I think they discovered that every time I touched the box of currants, I had a handful of currants or some tars or whatever was edible I ate, because I was, even though I'd been brought up to be strictly honest, I couldn't sort of think of food as belonging to anybody else. I was 3 weeks there as a message boy. It was a tough job. So I was a tall, skinny kid, and just had these boxes of groceries. They'd weigh anything up to half a hundredweight, and I'd get this on my shoulder and go tottering off up the very steep hills around in Paddington and Brisbane. And I really earned 75 cents a week. But shortly after that, they decided that I was eating the profits, and they'd have to let me go. And I got a job. I worked for all sorts of places, mostly as a message boy. I worked for a wholesale jeweller, for a firm that dry cleaned and blocked hats, for a wholesale tobacco company, for a cabinet maker. These were all sort of message boy jobs, and I was still working at the wholesale tobacconists when I joined the Navy in 1941. I wasn't called up to 1942, but I joined up in 1941 because they'd take you when you were 17.
That's how old you were then?
Yes. They called me up the following year. I had turned 18 in October 1941, and I was called up.
You didn't mention much about your war days in the first book.
No, I think I'd rather forget about my war days. I did list what I thought the proportions of the way I spent my time the 4 years I was in the Navy, and I wasn't exaggerating when I said we spent 80% of our time waiting for something to happen. This involved waiting on railway stations for trains, waiting for a truck to come and pick us up, waiting for somebody to tell us what to do. If ever I did a book about my Navy days, it certainly wouldn't have any blood and thunder or blood and guts in it. It'd be, I think, In fact, I had the perfect title for it. If ever I do write it, I'm going to call it 4 Years Without Thinking, because I spent 4 years without having to make up my mind about anything at all. There was always somebody to tell me what to do next, even if it took them a long time to get round to it. And then after they'd told me, they might change their mind 5 minutes later. In fact, I think it was HMAS Morton, the Naval Depot here in Brisbane, that used to stand where the new Parliament House, State Parliament House stands. There was a sign in one fellow's office that said, "Haven't you heard it's all been changed?" And I think that was a lot of my time in the Navy was spent.
Did it have much of an effect on you, start to finish, when you came out of the Navy? Different person?
Yeah, but you couldn't help but be different, because you'd seen nasty things, and apart from being totally bored, you had seen some nasty things, and it had bound to have some effect on you, especially a naive boy from bush like I was. I'd started writing, trying to write, well, I hadn't started writing poetry, I started trying to write poetry while I was in the Navy, and I was about 20. And I'd started reading a lot of poetry too, because I suddenly found out that I was interested in it. And I thought, well, if I'm going to go on trying to write this stuff, I better find out about it. So I didn't have anyone to say, this is a good poet, this is a bad poet, this is a course of reading. It was very simple. I used to just go to libraries and get anthologies of poems, and I'd read them through, and if I found a bloke whose poetry I liked, I went and got his collected works and read them, and this way I found all sorts of poets. There's probably a fairly diverse and odd way of approaching English poetry, but I was reading poets like Herrick, John Donne, whom I didn't understand at all, Kipling, I was a Kipling fanatic, Yeats, Houseman. I'll never forget finding Houseman's poetry for the first time.
What sort of response did you get from the other guys in the Navy?
Oh, they're very suspicious of this. Headphones crying from on the domestic, tried to write poems. It was all right after I'd sold my first 2 poems to the old Bulletin, the old City Bulletin. Then, if you could make money from it couldn't be all bad, you see. But I had some very odd looks. Fortunately, I'd known most of these blokes, and I'd spent some time with them before I started trying to do this. It was an impulse that it was just something inside me that wanted to come out, so I let it come out. And I just went on trying to write poetry for many years after that.
And following the Navy, you have various careers as detailed in that book.
Oh, tough in the old days, yes. Well, that covers really the next 2 moves. But the thing I wanted to get down in that book was that those particular years, 1946, 1947, were pivotal years in the sense of social history in Australia. They were the last years of the 30s values. The values of the 1930s held until the end of the Second World War, and for that 1 or 2 years afterwards. Even though there were far more jobs than there were men to fill them. A lot of the foremen and gangers and blokes like that, straw bosses, as the Americans call them, still retained the attitudes towards the blokes working for them that they'd had in the 30s. They tried to bully you, they tried to bounce you. And of course, men knew that they could get work anyway. So when somebody tried to bounce them, so there had to be some hard rethinking on both sides. But then, I think it was about 1948, the first of the really large groups of immigrants began to arrive. And of course, this liberalised Australian beliefs and mores with a leavening of international understanding, much more liberal views in some instances, and rather puritanical ethics we'd been brought up on. And the country began to change. The social climate began to change at that time and has gone changing ever since. I mean, it's a far more liberal society we live in these days than it was in the 30s.
So what would your second book be about if you followed that?
I don't know that I want to do a second book about my own history. I had considered doing a trilogy, one to cover the war years and then one for the first 2 years after the war, and then another one following on after that, about the early 1950s. But I don't know whether I'll ever get around to it now. There's so many other things.
What did you do following the?
After I'd left off being a steam engine driver.
Or what other various careers did you have?
Well, I came into Brisbane. I got a job as a storeman and packer. And after I'd done that for a while, I married and I decided I'd better learn a trade. The big thing in the 30s was always to get a trade. You had to have a trade. And the only thing I could do at that stage of the game that didn't need a 5-year apprenticeship was to become a steam engine driver. And this involved having 6 months actual work experience on a steam boiler or a stationary engine. And then studying and sitting for the appropriate exam for the Department of Machinery here in Brisbane. Well, I had done work on the locos in North Queensland, that time counted. I got a job as a trimmer on a boiler job here in Brisbane, finished in 6 months. Took the examination, got my certificate. I was still a third-class steam engine driver. And I worked at various jobs after that. I worked in a big pipe works, I was running the boiler where they were making concrete pipes, great big water culverts and things like that. I worked in a glass works, running the boiler in a glass works. I worked in a chemical factory where they were making ammonia gas out of tar liquor from the old gas works. I went back to Seagate for about 12 months on the Lighthouse vessel that runs from Brisbane up to Thursday Island and back. And late in 1954, I damaged my back in an accident at work, and the doctor said to me I wasn't going to be able to do hard physical work for many years again. I'd have to find some job that didn't involve hard physical labour. And while I was looking around, I was at compensation for about 5 months, I think, with this back. And while I was looking around, I met a bloke I knew one day in Brisbane. And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Actually, I'm looking for a job." And he said, "Well, I work in a retail bookshop. And the beginning of the school year is coming up. We always take on 3 or 4 temporary hands for 6 weeks while it's going on. Would that be any use to you?" And I still had by this time I had a fair knowledge, particularly Australia, because I'd been reading everything I could lay my hands on from libraries, beginning a collection of my own as I could afford it. And I said, "All right, I'll come work for you for 6 weeks. Be happy to." And 4 years later, I was running 2 sections there. I was running the fiction and general sections there, ordering from overseas and selling. I decided then that I was going to become a full-time writer. And that determination lasted about 6 weeks, and I realised that if you've got a young family and you just can't be a full-time writer in Australia and support a young family, not unless you're a genius. I certainly was no genius. So around about that time, I met another fellow, and he said to me, "I'm starting a publishing house, and I need someone as a storeman and packer for a few weeks. What about coming and give me 2 or 3 weeks' work as a storeman and packer?" And I said, "Yes, all right, I'll do that." And 14 years later, I decided that the time had really come for. By this time, the most of the children grow up and left home. I had my girl at home, and I owned a house, and I said, oh, with my wife's backing, I said, we're going to be poor again for a number of years, but I want to have a go at this. I think it's important. She said, I wondered how long it'd last. Good on you, go. And this I've been doing ever since. It'll be 10 years this year, end of September this year, since I decided to write full-time. A couple of times during that period, I've had to take a job for a few weeks, and I've gone quite broke. But gradually, as I've built up a lot of titles, I've published. I think in that almost 10 years, I've published about 14 books. I've averaged more than one book a year for the last 10 years, and I've got more coming up.
Which was the first book you published?
Very first book I ever published was a book called Focus on Judith Wright. That was published by University of Queensland Press, and was a book about Judith Wright and her poetry and how her living in Queensland from northern New South Wales had affected the quality of her writing and the content of her writing. So it's a fairly abstruse sort of book to begin a career with. Then the next one was a collection of my short stories called Some People. Then a collection of my poems that was called Brother and Brother. Then I edited an anthology of world poetry for use in high schools. Then from there on, I really got going on folklore. I did bushranger ballads with Pro Art. I did the complete book of Australian folklore for Lansdowne Press in Sydney. I did a book called Bushrangers for Child and Henry in Sydney. I did the second Penguin Australian folk song book. I did a book with John Meredith as a co-author called Ned Kelly, After a Century of Acrimony. But as well as that, I was working in other fields. I did a local history of Brisbane called Portrait of Brisbane. I did 2 novels for children, and both of which seemed to be fairly successful. I did Tough in the Old Days, which was that social history I was talking about before. And since then, I've done one more book, stuff that hasn't been published so far. I've got a collection of Australian yarns that I've taken from field tapes I've made to the tape machine, talking to blokes. A collection of Australian humorous verse that's coming out from Penguin about September this year. And another children's novel which has just been accepted for publication.
Was the interest in folklore a sudden thing, or was that always at the back of your head?
No, I think when I was in the Navy, I discovered that there were 3 kinds of music. There was the sort of music that highbrows listened to, which I had no interest whatsoever in those days. And then there was pop music that came from radios. A lot of that was country western and American ballad stuff and love songs. But there was a third kind of music that hovered around the fringes of this. Mostly in those days, because in the Navy, these were very indecent songs, like the Harlot of Jerusalem, things like that. But I enthusiastically learned them because they appealed to me enormously, and I learned as many of these as I could. I learned an awful lot of them too. And it wasn't until my brother Alan became interested in folklore, mainly because of his contact with Ron Edwards, who was a personal friend of his. Ron was only about 18 in those days, I think, when I first met him. He was working in Brisbane, but he was intensely interested in Australian folk music even then. And it wasn't until then that I decided that this was something. I realised there were these, I found out they were called folk songs. And I realised that there were folk songs from other countries all over the world, and I knew quite a number of these. But I didn't realise there were very many in Australia. I knew there were some. And my brother Alan got interested, and he started, he was singing and performing with the old original Sydney Bushwhackers band, the performing arm, as it were, of the Bush Music Society in New South Wales, Bush Music Club now. And when he began on this, I became very interested. And so I started digging around myself, and I found out that I already knew a number of these without having realised that they were folk songs. But I went on then to increase my repertoire, and then I became associated with Stan Arthur and the Moreton Bay Bushwhackers Band and the Queensland Folklore Society with Bob Michel, the late Bob Michel. And we were collecting. Bob was collecting, Stan was collecting, I was collecting. And we did turn in quite some interesting stuff, which we did collect here in the 50s, late 50s particularly.
Songs and stories, or mainly songs?
No, it was all songs in those days, because we realised, I think, that the people who knew the songs were very close to death by then. You know, that they were rapidly dying, because Mr. Edison invented his wind-up phonograph about 1900. The people who we want were the ones who had learned songs at the time when most people learned their songs and music in their teens and early 20s, which meant that by the 1950s, these people were in their 70s. Once the phonograph became universal and you could wind it up and you could hear Nellie Melba or Peter Dawson singing, nobody bothered so much anymore with writing songs or making songs or performing the songs, the old ones. Everybody said, "Oh, they're old-fashioned," and started singing the latest American coon songs and things like that, which were available to be learned from the phonograph. And so we got as many as we can. I don't think there will be any or many new old bush songs collected in Australia. I think we have just about what we can expect, out of the full body of the work, because I think everybody knew them.
Mm. What about the folk story by comparison, the yarn?
Well, I became interested in yarns. Ron's always been interested in yarns, and he's always collected them. But I became interested in them in a strange way. About the middle of the 1960s, about 1965, 66, I found out that there were certain stories. I came at it really from the international angle. I found out there were certain stories you kept hearing over and over again, and these stories were always told to you as having happened to an acquaintance of the person who told you. My brother knew this fellow, and this fellow told him that his brother, and it was always sort of first-hand, and they were incredible stories. And you kept encountering these. There was the one that brought it to my attention was one I always called the ready-mix concrete truck driver. And I'd heard this story from Cairns all the way around the coast of Perth. And it was nearly always set as having happened on the Gold Coast. It was nearly always related by someone who was told by someone who watched it or who heard about it or who lived down the road. But in effect, I became fascinated with this, and I tried to discover it, and there's absolutely no record of this story. I've since found that it's an international story, and it exists in all countries. It's in America, it's reported in newspapers in America, it's reported in England quite often. And I thought, there is a new international folk thing, and it's these stories. And how are they spreading? They're spreading by air, because international businessmen, nearly all of them have something to do with the internal combustion engine one way or other. They're about cars, they're about drivers, they're about aeroplanes, but mechanical contrivances, but 90%, 85% of them would deal with a motor car or a truck or a vehicle of some sort to enter the story in some way. And I think I collected about 15 different ones by 1969. I wrote the first article I did on, which was published by Wendy Wallenstein, a magazine called Australian Tradition. And this brought a response. At this time, I thought this was an Australian phenomenon, but it brought a response from a folklorist in the United States called Richard Royce. And he'd been collecting them over there, and he took this magazine and he saw that I was getting them. He wrote another article in response to that. So in Australian tradition, we have field for these stories. We've got quite a number of them. At present time, I'm still trying to collect, but I'm in contact with a man in America, a folklorist who has done a number of books of these stories, a man called Jan Brunvand, who is professor of folklore at the University of Utah. And I've just discovered that there is a folklorist working in England who's just published his first book. I've only just got my first copy of it. A man called Paul Smith has published a book called The Book of Nasty Legends. And I've just been sent a copy, not from England, but from a guy in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania, who knows I'm interested in them. And he's just sent it across to me. So I've just written to this fellow and said, I want to swap stories with you. I've got stories turning up here. I want to find out whether you already know them in England, like it's just the same to do with Brunvand in the United States. And I'm able to supply when Brunvand, for instance, is doing a book at the moment called The Choking Doberman, which is almost ready for publication. And he got all the stories about choking Dobermans from all over the United States. Smith advances the theory that this is a very old story, beginning with Geller in the poem that I was talking about before, how Geller dies, which is a version of the Choking Doberman story.
What's the Choking Doberman story?
This is, you may not have heard this one. It's about a young couple who own a large Doberman, and they go out to the movies one night, and they leave the Doberman locked in the house in case of burglars. And they come home, they find the dog is choking, apparently choking to death. They immediately race it down to the vet. And the vet goes to work on it and extracts 2 human fingers from its throat. So they race home and they discover a burglar on top of the wardrobe with 2 fingers missing, unconscious from loss of blood, and unable to get onto the floor because the Doberman was cast out. And this story has been reported from all over England and the United States, probably Europe too, and be there as well. But Brunvand wrote to me and said, have you got Choking Doberman in Australia? And I wrote back and said, no, I haven't. And then about a fortnight later, an account of this was published in the column 8 of the Sydney Morning Herald. And then about a week later, a friend of mine from Adelaide, who was up here he's a school teacher, he was up here during school holidays in January, told me another quite different, rather more ghastly version of it from Adelaide. Supposed to have happened in Adelaide. So I was able to immediately type up an email from Neil, who told me about the Adelaide event, and sent it to him. And I suspect these will, if there was time to get them in, if his publisher had written, they would have gone in as Antipodean examples of the Choking Doberman story to illustrate his next book.
What about your interest in Aboriginal stories, as evidenced by the...
the 2 children? Well, I'm not an expert on Aborigines, and I always take great care to point out that those books are novels. None of the legends related in those books are in fact Aboriginal, true Aboriginal legends. They are Aboriginal stories I wrote. I always make this very, very clear, as quickly as possible. I do have a great sympathy with many of the objectives of the Aboriginal people. I think their land rights issue is very important to them, and in a way which very few white people can ever hope to understand. Because we think of a piece of land, we think we own that land, where an Aborigine tends to think that land owns me. It's like trying to explain colour to a blind man for an Aborigine to try to tell a white man what the country means to him. But I've never pursued it. I've never pursued Aboriginal law. I've never pursued Aboriginal contacts or been active beyond writing occasional letters to the press. I've never been engaged with the Aboriginal community. I did have 3 very good friends who were all Aborigines. A man called William Mackenzie here in Brisbane. Mostly people called him Uncle William Mackenzie. And a fellow who was called Black Peter, he had no other name, whom I knew at Innisfail. And actually, I found his body when he died, after he died. And a fellow called Wilf Reeves, whom I didn't know nearly as well as I would like to have known, who was, his father had been a very important ceremonial man with the Butcher appeal from Fraser Island, and his mother had been the daughter of an English archdeacon who came out to civilise the savages, and his daughter fell in love with this black man, and they married, and they had 2 children, Wilf and his sister Olga. I think Olga's still alive. Olga married a fellow called Miller, but Wilf died. Wilf was 8th Division, I think, of the AIF, and had a very rough war in Bella, Changi in Bella. It was a prisoner of war. He died, I think, about the end of the 1960s. A lot of those fellas had a really rough time.
What about your interest in other countries' folklore?
Well,
Fairy tourism.
Well, I suppose one of the things I'm doing is I'm looking for archetypal stories. I think you find once you start to read the folk stories of just about every country, you find the same wisdom of experience embodied in a folk story or a fairy story, which can be told to children, or as a cautionary tale. But you find that just about all over the world and just about every culture, the people who tell these stories have arrived at pretty much the same sort of conclusions about the way people should behave, the best way for people to live together peacefully. And in some cases, they've been advanced to the statuses of religions. But you find out these common elements in all folklore. And I'm only really beginning the investigation of this, but I'm thoroughly enjoying it. Marvellous investigation has already been done by a man called Joseph Campbell in the United States, who published a very scholarly survey of the whole thing in 4 volumes called The Masks of God, which is available around Penguin. And he's done a study of world religion and world mythology, and sort of helped to sort out the varying structures that you like to find.
Have you taken your thoughts any further about the similarities in those stories?
I think just that human beings are basically fairly sensible people, and that they realise that certain truths are evident wherever they are in the world.
The truths about behavioural or morals, or
that it's better for people to help one another than to kill one another. Though some societies killing is not looked upon with any great opprobrium. For instance, in some societies that believe strictly in reincarnation, death is not important one bit. Doesn't matter if you die, you're going to be born again anyway fairly soon.
You were telling me last time about the Sufis and some of their stories. That sounded rather fascinating.
Yes, well, this is one of the things I'm having to take into consideration while I think about this Persian one that I hope to write, that I was talking about before, because I'd like it to have overtones of the Sufi story as well as being an entertaining legend. Because all these stories I'm doing are original. They are not traditional stories. They are original stories. But I'm trying to make them sound as much like traditional stories from particular countries as I possibly can.
Could you tell me a couple of those stories you told me last time about the...
About the Sufis. About the wisdom of the idiots, yes. Sufis specialise in teaching stories. And very often the hero of a Sufi story is a man who is apparently an idiot. And yet, when you consider his actions you realise that he is possibly acting very much within his own frame of reference, which is a different frame of reference from that of the people around him. There's a marvellous story about one Sufi teacher who had some pupils, and he went to the marketplace one day, and a wild-headed dervish came in from the desert. And the Sufi teacher thought he would speak to this dervish, who dervish is a holy man. And so he said to the dervish, "Who are you?" And the dervish said, "I don't know." And he said to him, where do you come from? And he said, "I'm not sure." He said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I don't know." And he said, "What's good?" And the bloke said, "What makes me comfortable?" And he said, "What's evil?" He said, "That which harms." And then he went off in a totally unexpected direction. Now, the students that this Sufi master had around him, they said, "How rude this man was, and what an idiot, and he must be punched in the head." And the Sufi master said to them, "Now you think about what he had to say, and you would realise that what he was doing was acting out the condition of 99.5% of humanity, who don't know where they come from, don't know where they're going, have a very wrong view of what is good and what is evil, and don't know who they are." So you see, that's one interpretation. You can put a number of interpretations. In fact, just about all Sufi teaching stories, you can put a number of interpretations. A very famous Sufi teaching story, but just about everybody's heard as a funny story in the West. Concerns a character who features in a lot of their idiot stories, a man they call the Mullah Nazaruddin. And the mullah was crawling around under a street lamp one evening, and a friend of his came by and said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I've lost my watch." And the bloke got down on his hands and knees and started to help him look for it. And he said to the mullah, "I don't think it's here. Where did you drop it?" And he said, "Well, down in the dark, around the corner there." And the bloke said, "Well, what are we looking for it here for?" And he said, "Well, there's a lot more light here." And the more you think about that story and apply it to the general run of people, you find that a lot of us spend a lot of time looking for things where they can't possibly be.
Mm.
The fascinating ones that I really love is the one about the mullah riding furiously through Baghdad on his donkey, beating them, shouting, "Get out of the way, get out of the way." And he shot through the marketplace, and then about 5 minutes later he came back from the opposite direction, beating his donkey and saying, "Get out of the way, get out of the way." And about the third time through they caught him. And they said, "Mullah, what are you doing?" He said, "I'm looking for my donkey." I think a lot of us spent a lot of their lives looking for a donkey.
Do you have any interest in the Sufis apart from their stories?
I'll put it this way: I'll get right away from mysticism because I don't know anything at all about mysticism at all. But I think, as a code of behaviour, what they advocate is very, very good indeed. Just the same as I admire them as much as I admire the true Franciscan brothers and sisters of the Christian Church and some of the Zen Buddhists of Japan.